What would you do if someone tried to take everything you've ever known, everything your family has worked for, and then, without remorse, threatened your very life for it? This isn't some abstract question, this is exactly what happened to my grandfather. His land, passed down through generations, was suddenly under threat. But it wasn't just any person trying to take it. No, it was Karen, the ruthless president of our homeowners association, HOA, and she had no intention of letting us keep what was ours. It all started innocently enough, or at least, that's how it seemed. The HOA had been asking for months for my grandfather to sell the property. We need to develop the area, they'd say, it's for the greater good of the community. At first, it seemed like a typical negotiation, the kind of thing families face when they live in neighborhoods with growing demands. But this was different. The more my grandfather resisted, the more the pressure mounted. And soon, it wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about something much darker. Karen was no stranger to power. She'd been involved in the HOA for years, using her position to manipulate and control those around her. She was used to getting what she wanted, whether it was through threats, lies, or outright force. And when my grandfather, with his stubborn pride and sense of family legacy, refused to budge, she decided it was time for more drastic measures. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For my grandfather, this wasn't just a piece of land, it was his life's work. It was the land he grew up on, the land he fought to preserve, and the land he had promised would stay in the family for generations to come. For him, selling wasn't an option. It wasn't about money or greed, it was about preserving the legacy, the history, and the spirit of the family. But for Karen, it was just another transaction. Another property to seize. And when she couldn't buy him out, she did something unimaginable. That day, the weight of the conflict was more than anyone could have anticipated. Karen, knowing she couldn't break my grandfather's resolve, took matters into her own hands, and everything changed in an instant. The peaceful, quiet life we had always known was shattered. The gunshot that rang out that afternoon didn't just silence our family, it destroyed us. In this story, there's no simple villain or hero. There's only my grandfather, a man of conviction and integrity who, until that fateful moment, had always been the strongest pillar of our family. And then there's Karen, the woman who would stop at nothing to take control, to break him, and to get what she wanted. As for me, the one telling this story, I was just a witness to a brutal truth, one that no one should ever have to face. So, I ask again, what would you do if your family's life and legacy were threatened in the most ruthless way? And what if no one could stop it? This is our story, a story of loss, betrayal, and the fight for justice. For weeks, the tension had been mounting, creeping into every conversation, every decision my grandfather made. The HOA's pressure was relentless. Karen, with her well-tailored suits and sharp words, had been coming to our door more frequently, each time with a new proposal, or rather, an ultimatum. She insisted that my grandfather sell the land. Think about the future, she'd say, her voice smooth, yet with an undercurrent of condescension. The development plans will be beneficial for everyone. You wouldn't want to be the one to hold the community back, would you? But my grandfather wasn't like everyone else. The land wasn't just dirt and soil to him, it was his soul, his history. It was the place where his father had worked, where his children had played, and where he'd built a life from nothing. The land had a story that couldn't be sold. No amount of money could convince him to give it up. So Karen's threats became more subtle. Instead of directly asking for the land, she began suggesting that the HOA would take action if he continued to refuse. The community will suffer, she said in one meeting. Your land, surrounded by new developments, is nothing but an eyesore. It's dragging down the property values of everyone else. But my grandfather wasn't interested in the value of property, he was interested in the value of family, heritage, and integrity. The land wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was his pride, his identity. Nothing can replace this place, Karen, he would say, his voice calm but unwavering. This land has stood here longer than your developments. It's not for sale. Karen didn't take well to being refused, and the subtle threats turned into overt intimidation. One day, my grandfather found a note on his doorstep. A single line written in bold, block letters, "If you don't sell, you'll regret it." It was unsigned, but we all knew who it came from. The HOA wasn't above intimidation, and Karen was at the helm. As the days wore on, I could see the toll it was taking on my grandfather. He was a proud man, a man who had spent his life building something that would outlast him. And now, with Karen's continuous push and the growing pressure from the HOA, it was clear that this wasn't just a matter of real estate. This was a battle for his very existence, for the land that defined him and his legacy. My grandfather had always been stubborn, but there was something deeper at play here. The land wasn't just property to him, it was his story, his connection to his ancestors. His grandfather had farmed it. His father had built the barn with his own hands. And now, my grandfather was determined to ensure that no one could erase that history. No matter what it took. But Karen didn't see it that way. She saw it as a simple transaction, a piece of land that could be bought and sold. She didn't understand the emotional weight of it. To her, it was just another business deal. And when business deals didn't go her way, she didn't hesitate to escalate. The first major warning came when my grandfather found a team of contractors on his land without permission. They had come to survey the property, as though they had a right to it. When he confronted them, they merely shrugged and said they were just doing their jobs. But my grandfather wasn't one to back down. He told them to leave, and they did, but not before one of them muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." That night, I sat with my grandfather on the porch, watching the stars. He never spoke much about his past, but that night, he opened up. "You know," he said softly, "I've had this land longer than most people live. It's not just dirt, it's history. It's my father's blood, sweat, and tears. I can't let them take it. No one can take it. Not even death." His words echoed in the quiet of the night, and for the first time, I felt a deep fear creeping over me. I could see the weight on his shoulders, the burden of this fight that was consuming him. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was a fight for everything he held dear. And that's when I knew, things were about to escalate. Over the next few days, things became increasingly tense. I began noticing more cars around the property, more unfamiliar faces, and the occasional sighting of Karen herself, standing just outside our gates, watching us. It was as if she were waiting for something, for the right moment to make her move. The quiet calm that had once defined our property was now replaced with a palpable unease. We couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was on the horizon, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Then, one evening, my grandfather sat me down at the kitchen table. He had the look of someone preparing for something they couldn't control. "Listen to me," he said, his voice grave. "If anything happens to me, you make sure they never get this land. You understand?" His eyes were full of determination, but there was a flicker of something darker there, something I couldn't quite place. "No one can take it. No one." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if he was preparing for the worst or if he was simply being dramatic. But his words lingered in my mind as the days grew shorter and the tension heavier. The final straw came one afternoon when Karen made a direct visit to the house. She stood at the door, her arms crossed, her lips curling into a cold smile. "I warned you," she said, her voice icy. "You can't keep refusing forever. This is for the good of the community. And if you don't sell, you're going to regret it." There was a hardness in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. My grandfather, his face set in stone, didn't even flinch. "I'm not selling," he said simply, his voice low but unwavering. "And I will never regret it." She didn't respond immediately, but the look she gave him was one I would never forget. It was a look of pure menace, as if she had already decided what would happen next. I could feel it then, something terrible was coming. Something irreversible. It was no longer just about land. It was about power, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she had it all. The stage was set. The darkness was closing in. And my grandfather was the only thing standing in her way. As we went to bed that night, I knew that things would never be the same. My grandfather had fought to protect this land for his entire life, but I feared that the battle was nearing its end. And when the morning came, the world would change forever. The morning felt no different than any other. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a pale light across the land. It was quiet, as it always was. The air was thick with anticipation, but no one dared speak about it. My grandfather had told me that if anything happened, I had to make sure the land stayed in our family. I didn't know what to make of his words then, but now, as I stood there beside him, they echoed louder than ever. We had just finished breakfast. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the cold, distant presence of the looming HOA. Karen had been lurking around the property for days, her presence undeniable, like the shadow of a storm. I could feel the heaviness in the air, the tension that seemed to cling to every step we took. My grandfather stood tall, as always, his face as steadfast as the land itself. "Are you ready for this?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Ready for what?" he replied with a quiet smile, his eyes twinkling with the strength of a man who had faced much worse. "Everything," I said, trying to mask my concern. "Everything that's coming." He didn't answer. Instead, he just gave me a knowing look, as if he already understood what was about to happen. As we stepped outside, the silence was broken by the sound of a car approaching. My stomach churned. It was Karen. The car came to a stop at the end of the driveway. I could see her through the window, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, her expression unreadable. She stepped out of the car slowly, her heels clicking on the gravel like a metronome, each step ringing louder in the stillness of the morning. "Grandpa, I don't like this," I whispered. My grandfather placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Don't worry. She'll leave. She always does." But Karen didn't leave. She walked straight up to us, her gaze locked on my grandfather, not even acknowledging my presence. Her smile was thin, cold, like the blade of a knife. "You still haven't reconsidered?" she asked, her voice sickly sweet, but with a venomous edge underneath. "You know what's at stake here, don't you?" "I told you already," my grandfather replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "This land is not for sale." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow step back and glanced over her shoulder. The silence grew louder, like the calm before a storm. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. "You've had your chance," she said coldly. "Now it's time for action." Suddenly, the tension snapped. Without warning, Karen reached under her jacket and pulled out a gun. The metallic glint of it was all I saw before she raised it towards my grandfather. The world seemed to slow down, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then came the sound, a deafening crack, followed by the horrible, hollow silence of the aftermath. The shot rang out. I could hardly process what happened. The air seemed to freeze, and my mind went blank. My grandfather didn't even have a chance to react. He was standing there, his hand still on my shoulder, his eyes locked on Karen, when the bullet struck him in the chest. "Grandpa!" I screamed. He staggered back, his legs giving way beneath him. The world tilted. I tried to reach for him, but everything moved too fast. My body felt frozen, as if the ground beneath me had vanished. Karen stood there, watching him fall, her expression unreadable, like she was watching a movie. She didn't flinch, didn't seem to care. Her eyes were cold, calculating. The gun was still in her hand, pointed at the ground as if she had just completed a simple task. My grandfather hit the ground hard, and the blood began to spread, soaking into the earth he had worked for his whole life. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as I pressed against his wound. His breathing was shallow, each one slower than the last. "Grandpa, please, stay with me, don't go," I choked on the words. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of helplessness that washed over me. But there was nothing I could do. I looked up at Karen, my vision blurry from the tears welling in my eyes. She hadn't moved an inch. She hadn't even taken a step towards us. She was just standing there, watching, her face still impassive. Her hand slowly lowered the gun, but there was no remorse in her eyes, only satisfaction. "This was your choice," she said, her voice cold, distant. "You had your chance." I wanted to scream, to charge at her, to make her feel the pain I was feeling, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed with grief and rage. All I could do was watch as Karen turned and walked away, leaving us there in the dirt. The blood spread further, darker, as if the land itself was bleeding. You can't just leave." I cried, but the words barely made it past my lips. She didn't turn around. I knew, in that moment, that she was already gone. The car door slammed shut, and I watched in disbelief as she got in, driving off without a single glance back. The sound of her tires screeching against the gravel felt like a final insult. The cruelest part was that she had just destroyed everything, without hesitation, without a single ounce of regret. For her, it had been nothing more than a transaction. A cold, heartless business deal. But for me, for my family, it was the end of everything we had ever known. I turned back to my grandfather, his life draining away before my eyes. The land that had meant so much to him, to all of us, was now tainted by the violence that had unfolded. And I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The pain was unbearable, the guilt suffocating. I didn't know how to save him, and in my heart, I feared that it was already too late. The life in my grandfather's eyes was fading fast, and as I held him, I realized the worst truth of all: Karen had won. She had taken everything, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The sound of her car fading in the distance felt like the cruelest reminder that there was no justice, not today, not in this moment. Only a cold, painful reality. The seconds after the shot felt like hours. Everything around me seemed to move in slow motion, the rush of blood spreading into the dirt, the shallow, painful breaths my grandfather struggled to take, the sickening realization that something irreversible had just happened. For a moment, I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do, where to go. I remember hearing my own voice, but it sounded far away, muffled by the roaring panic in my chest. "Grandpa. Please." I shouted, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I pressed against his wound, trying to stop the blood that was quickly pooling beneath him. His eyes fluttered open, his weak gaze meeting mine with a clarity that seemed out of place in that moment. Don't worry about me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, each word punctuated by labored breaths. "You have to protect the land. Promise me." I could feel his body growing colder, the warmth slipping away. It was the kind of coldness that no amount of pressure on the wound could stop, the kind that comes with the finality of death. "I promise, Grandpa, I promise," my voice cracked as I fought to hold it together. I could feel the tears spilling, but I couldn't stop them. The world around me had shifted, and nothing seemed real anymore. My mind screamed for help, but all I could do was watch as his life drained away before me. Minutes passed, though it felt like a lifetime. I couldn't tell how long it had been before I finally heard the distant sound of sirens. I tried to call for help, but my throat was tight, choking on the weight of the moment. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, on us. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My grandfather's life was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. The ambulance arrived, but it was already too late. The paramedics rushed to him, their hands moving with practiced urgency, but they all knew the truth before they even started. The blood loss, the position of the wound, it was fatal. The doctors would later tell us that even if they had arrived sooner, the damage was too severe. My grandfather had been shot point blank, and the damage to his heart was too much to overcome. "We're sorry, but there's nothing we can do," one of the paramedics said, his voice gentle but distant, as if he had said those words too many times before. I couldn't process what I was hearing. "No, no. There has to be something." I cried, but my voice was small and desperate, consumed by the overwhelming grief that surged through me. But there was nothing. It was over. My grandfather was gone. The next few hours were a blur. I remember the police arriving, their presence like a cold shadow over everything. They began asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened, but I couldn't form coherent thoughts. My mind was a fog of disbelief and sorrow, unable to reconcile what I had seen with what I was hearing. Karen had already disappeared, vanished without a trace. No one knew where she had gone or if she had even realized the gravity of what she had done. No one in the neighborhood had seen anything, or if they had, they were too afraid to speak up. The police seemed to be moving slowly, as though the situation wasn't urgent enough for them to really care. It was just another case of violence, nothing to set it apart from the countless other cases they dealt with every day. "Did anyone witness the shooting?" one of the officers asked, his voice flat. I shook my head, my throat tight. I was the only one here, and she just left. She didn't care. She just left him to die. The officer jotted something down in his notebook and then nodded. "Right. Well, we'll look into it. We'll talk to the neighbors." I felt a surge of anger. Talk to the neighbors? How could anyone sit around and just talk about this? My grandfather was dead. The land was being taken, piece by piece, and no one was doing anything to stop it. Karen was the murderer, but she was out there somewhere, free to continue her reign of terror. And all the police could offer was an empty promise to look into it. The emotional devastation that followed was something I could never have prepared for. The world seemed different, colder, harsher, and I felt as though the fabric of everything I had known had unraveled. My grandfather, the one who had taught me about perseverance, about standing firm in the face of adversity, was gone. The man who had worked his entire life to preserve the legacy of our family, to make sure we never forgot where we came from, was lying in a cold, sterile morgue, never to return. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating. But what made it worse was the sense of helplessness that followed. Karen had won. She had taken everything without a fight. The land, the legacy, the family, they were all shattered. And there was no one to stop her. I spent the next few days in a daze. The funeral was a blur of faces and muted voices, everyone offering their condolences, but it all felt so hollow. I couldn't bring myself to speak to anyone. All I could think about was the way Karen had walked away, as if she had just completed another transaction, as if my grandfather's life had meant nothing. I wanted justice, but there was no justice. The authorities moved too slowly. The people around us didn't understand the depth of what had happened. No one seemed to realize that this wasn't just about a piece of land, it was about the life of a man who had lived and died with honor. The emotional fallout was far-reaching. My family, once strong and united, was now fractured. We had lost a pillar, and the weight of that loss was more than anyone knew how to carry. My grandmother, who had been with my grandfather for decades, was inconsolable. My father couldn't bring himself to speak. We all sat in silence, each of us lost in our grief, struggling to make sense of what had happened. And me? I was no different. The anger and sorrow I felt gnawed at me, never letting me rest. My grandfather's final words echoed in my mind, "You have to protect the land." But how could I protect it now? How could I fight against the forces that had taken everything from us? In the weeks that followed, I tried to find answers. I dug into the HOA, into Karen's history, hoping to find something, anything, that could prove that she was guilty. But every door I knocked on remained closed. The legal system was slow, and everyone seemed more interested in protecting the interests of those in power than they were in pursuing justice. But that rage, that grief, that overwhelming desire for justice never left me. It became my fuel. And though it felt like the world was closing in on me, I knew one thing for certain: would never let Karen walk away without consequences. I would make sure that my grandfather's legacy wasn't just buried in the dirt, but that it would rise from the ashes. I would find a way to make sure she paid for what she had done. For my grandfather. For my family. For the land that he had worked so hard to protect. And no matter how long it took, I would make sure that the truth was known. The days following my grandfather's death blurred into a haze of mourning and disbelief. But despite the overwhelming grief, a burning question consumed my every thought: why wasn't anyone doing anything about Karen? She had taken my grandfather's life, and the law seemed paralyzed by her manipulation. The more I learned, the more I realized that justice wasn't something that would simply come, it was something I would have to fight for. At first, the police investigation seemed like a formality. They showed up, took statements, and filled out their reports. But then, as time passed, it became clear that Karen was getting away with murder, quite literally. The police were slow to act, and I soon realized why. Karen wasn't just some random person, she was deeply embedded in the fabric of the HOA, a woman with connections, power, and influence. The more I looked into her, the more I realized how carefully she had built her network. It wasn't just a neighborhood association to her, it was a means to control, to manipulate, and to silence anyone who stood in her way. The detectives working the case seemed like they were making progress at first. I remember one officer, Detective Hayward, calling me into the station. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the kind who didn't sugarcoat things. "We're going to look into Karen," he said, his voice steady. "We have to. But you need to understand something. She's got connections. The HOA board has more influence than you think, and it's going to be a tough fight." I nodded, though a part of me felt a deep unease. It wasn't just about the investigation anymore, it was about the system, the way things worked when people with power could sway the truth. I dug deeper, trying to find anything that might link Karen directly to my grandfather's death. It wasn't easy. Every lead seemed to go cold. The HOA members were tight-lipped, and anyone who had once spoken openly about her now refused to talk. I began to feel the weight of a system that was working to protect her, rather than seek justice. But then, one afternoon, I received a breakthrough. A new character entered the picture, a journalist named Claire Hartman. She had been following the HOA's activities for years, and when she heard about my grandfather's death, she contacted me. She was no stranger to corruption and manipulation, having uncovered several high-profile cases involving local politicians and corporate leaders. But this case, my grandfather's death, was different. It wasn't just about corruption, it was about a family, about legacy, and about a man whose life had been stolen. People like Karen, they're used to getting away with things because no one challenges them. But I've been digging into the HOA for a while, and I think there's something we can use, Claire told me when we first met. Karen doesn't just run the HOA, she runs the town. If we're going to make any headway, we need to find the cracks in her armor. I was cautious at first, unsure of whether she could be trusted. But Claire wasn't like the others. She didn't care about favors or politics. She cared about the truth. And that was exactly what I needed. Claire began digging into Karen's past, into the HOA's records, and into the people who had crossed Karen in the past. It didn't take long for Claire to uncover something significant, a series of secret meetings between Karen and powerful local businessmen, all of whom had an interest in the land my grandfather had refused to sell. It was no longer just about Karen trying to take a piece of land, it was about greed, and the people backing her were willing to do anything to ensure they got it. "I've got something," Claire said one night, her voice urgent as she leaned over the files she had gathered. "There's a pattern here, something they've been covering up for years. Karen and the others have been using the HOA to get land at dirt cheap prices, and anyone who gets in their way disappears, one way or another. But despite Claire's breakthrough, the road to justice was far from clear. Karen wasn't just a powerful figure within the HOA, she was connected to people who could pull strings, people who had far more influence than I realized. As Claire dug deeper, she began receiving threats. Strange calls in the middle of the night. Threatening emails. And then, one day, her office was broken into. The files she had been working on, the very evidence that could prove Karen's involvement, were stolen. "We're getting close," Claire had said, frustration in her voice. "But every time we make a move, they cover their tracks. They're playing dirty, and they know we're on to them." It wasn't just Claire who was under threat. As the investigation continued, I found myself the target of subtle intimidation. Late-night phone calls with heavy breathing. Strange cars parked outside my house. It was clear that Karen and her allies knew we were close to uncovering the truth. But they didn't realize how far I was willing to go to get justice for my grandfather. The legal system itself became an obstacle. The more I pressed, the more I was stonewalled by lawyers who were either too afraid to take on Karen's powerful backers or who were simply in her pocket. One of the attorneys I met with told me, "You're wasting your time. Karen has been untouchable for years. She has connections everywhere. No one is going to touch her." But I couldn't give up. I wouldn't give up. With each new revelation, the investigation grew more intense. I began receiving anonymous tips, some of which led to nothing, and others that put me on the trail of something much bigger than I had initially imagined. One evening, Claire called me with urgent news. "Meet me at the old warehouse near the docks," she said, her voice sharp. "I've found something that will change everything. I need you to be there." I arrived at the warehouse just as the last rays of sunlight were fading. The warehouse was dark and abandoned, with only the faint hum of the city in the distance. When I walked in, Claire was waiting, her face pale. "I found the ledger," she said, holding out a thick book, its pages yellowed with age. "It's all in here. The deals, the names, the bribes, everything. And it's all tied to Karen. But it's more than just her. This goes all the way to the top." I took the ledger from her, my heart pounding. The names, the dates, the transactions, they were all there, in black and white. It was evidence that would blow the entire conspiracy wide open. I felt a surge of hope. Finally, I had what I needed to bring Karen down. But just as I was about to speak, the door to the warehouse slammed open, and a group of men stepped inside. They were big, intimidating figures, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. "I think it's time you stop digging into things that don't concern you," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. I froze, realizing that we had just walked straight into a trap. They knew we had the ledger. They knew we were getting close to exposing everything. Claire and I exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, just as quickly, the tension in the room broke. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The police, Detective Hayward and his team, had arrived, but I didn't know how long it would take for them to reach us. "Get out of here!" Claire shouted. Now! It was a race against time. As the men began to close in, we made a break for the back exit, with the ledger clutched tightly in my hands. The police arrived just in time, but the men were already gone. It was a small victory, but it felt like we were finally on the brink of something big. As the investigation into Karen and the corrupt forces behind her continued to unfold, I could feel the walls closing in. The obstacles were vast, but with each small victory, I began to feel a glimmer of hope. Karen's empire of power was starting to crumble, and I knew that no matter how hard she fought back, I wouldn't stop until justice was served. For my grandfather. For our family. And for the land that had once been our home. The day of the trial was like no other. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of what was at stake. After months of digging, of relentless pursuit, it had all come down to this. I sat in the back of the room, my eyes fixed on the front, where Karen sat, her once calm demeanor now visibly shaken. She had maintained an air of superiority throughout the investigation, but now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, her confidence had cracked. She no longer had the same control over the situation that she once thought she would. The courtroom was full, the press, local witnesses, even people who had been affected by her actions were there, some supporting us, others hoping to see her finally face the consequences of what she had done. The gavel slammed down, signaling the start of the proceedings, but as I looked around at the faces of those who had once been silent, I couldn't help but feel a surge of vindication. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had been hurt by Karen's greed and manipulation. It had taken months of tireless work, the investigation, the threats, the setbacks. But in the end, the ledger Claire had found, the testimonies from the neighbors, and the undeniable trail of corruption had all led to this moment. The case against Karen was clear. She had used her power to manipulate the system, to destroy the lives of those who stood in her way, and to take what didn't belong to her. But now, she could no longer hide behind her wealth or her influence. As the prosecution laid out their case, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed since my grandfather's death. We had lost so much, and no amount of money or victory could bring him back. But with every word, with every piece of evidence presented, it felt like justice was finally within reach. Karen had taken my grandfather's life, but she couldn't take away his legacy, and she couldn't erase the truth of what she had done. The trial wasn't just about Karen. It was about the transformation I had undergone over the past months. I had come from a place of pure grief, of anger and confusion, to a point of clarity and purpose. When I first stood in front of my grandfather's grave, I couldn't see beyond the loss. I couldn't imagine how I would ever move forward. But now, sitting in that courtroom, I realized that I had taken the first steps toward something more than revenge. I had taken steps toward healing, for myself, for my family, and for the land that my grandfather had so fiercely protected. My family, too, had changed in the process. My grandmother, who had been crushed by the weight of her grief, had found a sense of strength she didn't know she had. She had stood beside me through every moment, even when I doubted the possibility of justice. My father, though still haunted by the loss, had found his own way of coping. He had stepped up when it mattered most, providing support when I needed it the most. And my mother, though devastated, had always reminded me that we were stronger than the forces trying to tear us apart. Through this journey, we had all grown. We had all learned that we could not only survive but also fight back. And then there was Karen. The woman who had once been untouchable, the woman who had manipulated everyone in her path, had finally been stripped of her power. She sat in that courtroom, her mask of confidence slipping away with each piece of evidence presented against her. But I couldn't bring myself to feel satisfaction. There was no joy in seeing her fall. There was only the cold realization that it was never about her, it was about the land, my family, and the memory of my grandfather. The verdict came swiftly, almost too swiftly. Karen had been found guilty on all counts, for the murder of my grandfather, for her manipulation, for her years of corrupt practices under the guise of the HOA. The judge handed down a sentence that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Karen would face the consequences of her actions, the ones she had so carefully tried to avoid. But the weight of her guilt wasn't the only thing that was heavy. The courtroom was filled with the echo of something much deeper, a sense of justice being restored. As the gavel struck again, signaling the end of the trial, I stood up, my hands trembling slightly. The emotions that had built up over the months, the anger, the sorrow, the helplessness, now felt like a distant memory. It was over. And while it didn't bring my grandfather back, it gave me something more important: closure. The days after the trial were quiet. The house felt emptier, even though my family was still there. It was strange, to be free from the constant feeling of impending doom, but also to realize that nothing could ever truly return to what it was before. My grandfather's absence was still a presence, lingering in every corner of our home, in every space where he had once stood. But now, instead of feeling suffocated by the grief, I felt a sense of peace beginning to settle in. We held a memorial for my grandfather, and though I was still devastated by his loss, there was something different in the air. It wasn't the heavy weight of grief anymore. It was the sense that my grandfather's legacy, the land, the stories, the memories, would live on. He had fought for his family, for his history, and even though he was no longer there to carry that fight, I was ready to continue it. As I stood there, looking out over the land that had meant so much to him, I realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what we choose to do with the pain we've endured, the lessons we've learned, and the future we're building. My grandfather had never backed down from a fight. And now, neither would I. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't seeing Karen brought to justice. It wasn't the legal battles or the triumph over corruption. It was the realization that, even in the face of loss, we have the power to choose how we move forward. We can choose to remain broken, or we can choose to rebuild. And as I stood there, I made a promise to myself, to my family, and to my grandfather, who would carry on his legacy. I would protect this land, and I would make sure that his memory, his fight, would never be forgotten. Justice had been served, but the real story had only just begun. As I stand here, reflecting on everything that has happened, I realize how deeply our lives have been shaped by the land my grandfather fought to protect. His refusal to sell wasn't just about stubbornness, it was about legacy. It was about family. And while we may never get him back, we now carry the weight of his fight forward. The price of land, as we learned the hard way, can sometimes be measured in blood. But it's also measured in the strength of those who refuse to back down, in the resilience of a family unwilling to let go of what is rightfully theirs. Justice has been served, but there is so much more to be done. The fight for truth, for the preservation of integrity, and for the rights of individuals to stand firm against corruption, it is a battle that continues beyond the courtroom. The land my grandfather protected isn't just a physical place. It's a symbol of everything worth fighting for: family, honor, and justice. But this story doesn't end with a verdict. It's a reminder of the power each of us holds, the power to protect what we love, to stand up against wrong, and to ensure that future generations never forget the sacrifices made. Now, as I move forward, I encourage all of you to take a moment to reflect on your own legacy. What would you protect? What fight would you take on, no matter the cost? The lesson here is clear: we all have a responsibility to stand up for what is right, no matter how overwhelming the forces against us may seem. If this story resonated with you, I encourage you to like, comment, and share your thoughts. How far would you go to protect your family, your land, or your legacy? What are your thoughts on justice, and what does it mean to you? Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and let's continue the conversation about standing firm, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Your voice matters. Together, we can make sure that the fight for what's right never fades.